Hey everyone, I'm Phil Albertelli, and this is The Week in Doubt, a podcast for atheists, agnostics, and whomever. Whomever's grammatically correct, so I'm told. Still sounds kind of too formal, but what you gonna do? So anyway, let's get on with the show. It was probably about a week ago now, so a little stale, but Jordan Peterson took part in one of those Jubilee reverse debate gangbang things, and pretty interesting, for lack of a better word. It went about how you might imagine it would go if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson. A lot of time wasted arguing about definitions, Peterson being evasive when asked to clarify his own religious beliefs or whether or not he's even a Christian, and occasionally leaning in and glowering indignantly at the person sitting across from him. I downloaded the video and broke it up into clips. And full disclosure, I recently published a Patreon bonus episode in which I reacted or responded to some of the clips already. So in fairness to my Patreon supporters, I probably won't go over those clips again now, but I will go over the remaining clips. And so arguably the most viral moment from the debate was when someone confronted Peterson with a hypothetical situation or a thought experiment involving Nazi Germany, and Peterson gets very kind of offended, gets his back up, and I think people kind of took issue with his response. But I'll play it now, and I broke this clip up into even smaller clips, and so I'll be pausing here and there.
How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I guess since you said morality and purpose cannot be found in science, it would just depend on like what you're referencing. If you're saying a description of your psychological preferences would be considered within science, sure. But I don't think that you have to say that it comes from science in order to be like an atheist. As an agnostic atheist, I don't know if God exists and I don't believe that a God exists. And the only ones that I would really reject would be like the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect notion of God that plenty of Christians like prescribe themselves. So I guess
How is that relevant to this claim?
You're basing a position of morality and purpose in some like notion of God that isn't the same type of notion of God that typical Christians would prescribe. Your notion of God is
What typical Christians?
Yeah, typically when I talk to Christians, they say that they believe in an all-knowing.
How about Cardinal Newman, who defined God as conscience? He has a major influence on all of Catholic social theory. How about that Christian?
So only a little bit in, and already Peterson has kind of an attitude. He's already acting indignant towards this young guy that so far is being pretty polite. And it's funny, I think the kid's name is Parker, and he gives me Peter Parker vibes. Anyway, yeah, I actually like this kid, and his worldview seems pretty similar to mine, at least regarding my atheism. He identifies as an agnostic-atheist, says he admits he doesn't know if a God exists, but he doesn't believe in a God or doubts the existence of one, which is how I describe my own worldview often. And my own atheism kind of waxes or wanes, gets weaker or stronger, depending on the specific concept of God I'm being presented with. And he's talking about the kind of classic God with all the omnis, some kind of personal creator God who's omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, etc. Which is, I'm pretty skeptical that such a God exists. Not opposed to it. I actually hope there is an afterlife and some kind of benevolent higher power out there. I'm just skeptical due to the seeming lack of evidence for a personal creator God or an afterlife. And I myself felt a little indignant on this kid's behalf when Peterson kind of snaps at him and says, what kind of typical Christian or whatever, right? Because I'm thinking, as someone who is raised Catholic and who grew up around Christians all my life, and most of my family members, etc., are still Christian, as far as I know, or at least there are people who still believe in a God, but maybe their Catholicism has kind of lapsed. Usually people seem to mean a personal creator God, an interventionist God, a God who watches and judges, and that when you die will decide whether you spend eternity in heaven or hell, right? So, yeah, the average Christian does seem to believe in a personal creator God, as far as I can tell from personal experience. So I don't know why Peterson was copping such an attitude when the kid was politely talking about typical Christians, you know? But in the spirit of fairness, or to play devil's advocate, so to speak, I was recently watching William Lane Craig's reaction to Peterson's Jubilee appearance. And if you're not familiar, William Lane Craig is this really well-known Christian apologist. He took part in a lot of debates with some high-profile atheists like the late, great Christopher Hitchens, that kind of thing. And he had plenty of criticism for Peterson's kind of wishy-washy approach to Christianity or whatever. But he did say that he himself thinks that most Christians have kind of an overly simplistic concept of God and lack a deeper theological or philosophical understanding of what God is, in Craig's own kind of rarefied, highly educated view. And Craig is someone I know who doesn't necessarily take, the Bible entirely literally. For instance, he embraces the idea of human evolution, so he doesn't think that the story of the garden and Adam and Eve is to be taken literally. But at the end of the day, he still believes in a personal creator God. In fact, one of the things he's best known for is his own updated take on something known as the Kalam cosmological argument, which goes back to medieval Islamic philosophy and is itself, I believe, a kind of variant of, or was at least partially shaped by, Aristotle's cosmological argument, or argument from first cause, about how there needs to be a first cause, and that cause is God. I believe, similar to Stephen C. Meyer, he views God as this kind of necessary mind or divine intelligence behind everything that's outside of or not limited by time and space. Something to that effect, and even though he might not take everything in the Old Testament literally, I know when it comes to the New Testament, he tends to view the Gospels as historical documents. And yes, he does believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus. And then Peterson brings up Cardinal Newman, who is a 19th century theologian who I believe was originally Anglican and converted to Catholicism. And he talks about Newman made me think of Seinfeld, who, according to Peterson, defined God as conscience, or the voice of conscience. And I looked into it, and apparently Newman placed a lot of emphasis on following our conscience, and that one of the ways in which God manifested was as the voice of conscience, or kind of spoke to us through that, that inner voice, which is something you find in a lot of traditions. It's kind of reminiscent of the daemon, not demon, of Socrates. The idea that there was this, kind of Jiminy Cricket-esque voice in all of us that tells us right from wrong, But that isn't mutually exclusive with the idea of a personal creator God. To the contrary, Newman believed in a personal creator God, and conscience was a messenger from, or the voice of, that God speaking to us and guiding us. But of course, Peterson, who takes this kind of airy-fairy Jungian, drenched in symbolism approach to, Christianity, and won't even admit whether or not he's actually a Christian, puts a more mundane psychoanalytical spin on it, kind of suggesting, at least it would seem to me, that, yeah, conscience, that inner voice we all have that tells you right from wrong, that's God. Figuratively speaking, at least that seems to be where he's coming from. And he's kind of implying that's the way even Cardinal Newman saw it. When Cardinal Newman was a believing Christian who, as I understand it, believed in biblical miracles, believed in a resurrected Jesus, and believed in a personal God. And once again, according to Newman, conscience was God speaking to or through us. But there was a God doing that speaking, an actual divine supernatural God. Whereas for Peterson, I get the feeling, if we could actually get him to admit to it, that in reality he's kind of thinking, yeah, there might not actually be a man behind the curtain, but that voice inside your head, that's kind of God in a sense, right? Figuratively. Then later, during a different exchange, he'll also suggest that some of the biblical patriarchs or prophets also define God as conscience, as that voice within, which I think probably is true, but I bet like Newman, they also believed, take a drink, they also believed in God as an actual divinity outside of themselves. The Yahweh of the Hebrew Bible, who, yes, was kind of mysterious and elusive and transcendent, but also a patriarchal deity, a personal God. And disclaimer, I myself am not a biblical scholar or a scholar of any kind. But as someone with a long-standing interest in this stuff, I believe it's the consensus that if you dig back far enough, it seems to be the case that Yahweh was originally a kind of storm or war god, part of a or the Canaanite pantheon. There were different Canaanite peoples, and eventually became the chief or national deity of the Israelites. So we're talking about people who actually believed in gods or divinities, or at least one at least by that point, because of course the Hebrews or Israelites eventually became monotheistic. I think there's suggestion they may have originally been or for a while where probably started out polytheistic, moved on to henotheism, then eventually monotheism. Henotheism is when you believe that other gods do exist, but you only worship one God, and you put your one specific God above all others. But apologies for the digression. Let's not keep poor Parker waiting, and alliteration, and continue on.
Sure. So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean when you say you believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
I said you think it to be true.
All right. So if you believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that. It isn't something that you say. It isn't something that's associated with logical consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action. And you're either fragmented, in which case you worship multiple gods, or there's some unity at the bottom of it that makes you an unstoppable force.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay. So then,
how would you define belief? Something you say?
Well, can I explain? Like, I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your life.
Don't be so sure.
I think maybe the kid could have just stopped at, I believe it's the case this pen exists or whatever, right? Because I think for all his highfalutin intellectualism, I get the feeling that Peterson is being kind of stubbornly obtuse. It's like he knows the normal way people use, but there's two normal ways I think people use the word belief. You can use belief to refer to your moral beliefs, your principles, things that you would perhaps die for, right? And on the other hand, people use the word belief commonly to refer to the act of regarding something as being empirically or objectively true or factual. Unless we're brains in a vat or living in the Matrix or a simulation, the kid was right to say that he believes that there really is a pen in front of him. Peterson knows what people mean by believe. I think he just didn't like being asked point blank whether or not he believed in an actual, the usual concept of God, a actual supernatural personal creator God who possesses all the omnis. And so he does that weaselly thing where he tries to get you to overthink what a word used in everyday parlance means. You know, depends on what you mean by believe. He asked, I mean, he gave you the definition of the God, the type of God he was talking about, and asked you point blank, do you believe in it? And I've mentioned it on the show before that Jordan Peterson really resents when people try, as he sees it, to back him into a corner or pin him down on whether or not he actually believes in God. He views it as people trying to trap him. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe that's something you should try to get over. Or either that, don't keep putting yourself in the position of debating atheists or engaging in contentious discussions about religion, right? I mean, you're sitting across from people talking about religion, talking about belief, talking about the Bible. Shouldn't you expect that someone just might ask you whether or not you personally believe in God? And it's funny, the event was originally supposed to be entitled A Christian versus 20 Atheists. And I believe that was actually the working YouTube title of the video. And then Peterson reached out to Jubilee and got them to change it to Jordan Peterson versus 20 Atheists because he doesn't even like saying whether or not he's a Christian, which I think is kind of bizarre. If he had a regular job, if he worked at Walmart or something, and, or even like, let's say he was still working in academia and he was afraid that if he admitted he was a Christian, that some of his more kind of liberal or secular colleagues might, turn on him or marginalize him. It's like, I could see how maybe, you'd be like, my faith is private. But your job is pretty much at this point talking up Christianity and the Bible. And there's a lot of Christians who enjoy you because of that and look up to you. And yet you won't even admit whether or not you yourself are a Christian. It's just, I think at the end of the day, it's his life. No one should be compelled to reveal something about themselves they don't want to reveal. I just think it's frickin' weird.
You wouldn't lie to save your life?
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Would you lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
Can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone's
Yeah,
life?
and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
And for those of you listening to the audio-only version of the show, obviously you're going to miss Peterson's body language, but at this point he's really leaning in, intensely glaring at the kid sitting across from him, Parker. And I just recently found out in the middle of recording that I think he hosts a YouTube channel called Parker Get a Job or something like that. But anyway, I stopped to comment on this because it's just something very strange I noticed, that Peterson almost seemed to decide right away when someone sat down across from him what kind of attitude he was going to take. Was he going to be intense and indignant, or was he going to be patient and friendly? And I couldn't figure out how he was, what his reasoning was, because everyone who sat down across from him, for the most part, seemed to, at least initially, be fairly respectful and reasonable. So I don't know how, why he was deciding to take different attitudes with different people before things even, got heated. But yeah, he didn't seem to like Parker very much for some reason. And we haven't even gotten to the really juicy part of their confrontation yet that went viral. But yeah, I noticed that Peterson seemed to take a significantly more kind of kinder and gentler approach with his female interlocutors or debate opponents. And at first, and maybe I was being too cynical, I was thinking, oh, maybe suddenly he finds himself sitting across from these attractive young women and decides to kind of soften up his approach because he's kind of taken with their charms or whatever. But there was at least one other male opponent that he was also kind of kind and patient with and almost seemed to have a fondness for. So yeah, I don't know, but let's continue.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany, and it is the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them, would you lie to like the Nazis? If
I
they're
would have
asking?
done everything I bloody well could so I wouldn't be in that situation
you
to
lie?
begin with.
So this is the part that a lot of people, including myself, had a problem with. And yeah, I can remember watching this for the first time, and as soon as he said that, and he'll double down on it, I'm like, did he really say what I think he said? Because he seems to be implying that if you were in Nazi Germany and found yourself in the position of having to lie or choose whether or not you were going to lie to the authorities in order to save the lives of Jewish people you were hiding or protecting, that it would be your fault somehow for ending up in that position. And I don't think it applies to this particular context, which is what makes Peterson's position here so weird. But generally speaking, I think there is some truth to Peterson's idea that if you find yourself in a bad position, it may be because you made a series of bad or harmful decisions in the past that led you to that point. And I think that we're shaped by our life experiences, especially our early life experiences. And I think you do have to take personal responsibility at the end of the day. But at the same time, and we could get into a whole debate about free will, I think who we end up being or what choices we make in life are, once again, at least in part, the result of our early life experiences, being shaped by both nature and nurture. So I try to maintain at least some compassion for anyone who finds themselves in a bad place in life. Because in a very real sense, it's probably not entirely their fault. And once again, I don't think this really applies to the Nazi Germany example or hypothetical, because if you find yourself in the position of being able to save lives from a evil, murderous, fascistic government or regime, I don't see why you necessarily would have had to have made a series of poor decisions to find yourself there. It's the corrupt, evil, murderous regime that's veered off from the path of righteousness. You're actually in the place of acting as a decent person and trying to preserve human life. I think a good example of someone who finds his or herself in a bad place because of decisions they've made in the past might be someone who finds themselves in prison because maybe they had a messed up childhood, joined gangs at an early age, got steeped in a life of crime, or maybe got caught up in drugs when they were young because, they were trying to escape the misery of their home life or whatever, and then ended up addicted as an adult and their life just goes off the rails. And once again, I have compassion for anyone who had a rough upbringing or was dealt a bad hand in life. I can relate. I don't think it frees you from consequences and you still have to take responsibility in life. But I think it's good to remember, not to sound like a broken record, that people are shaped by their life experiences, by both nature and nurture, their upbringing, their genetics. And Peterson seems to be leaving out something that I'm pretty sure he's talked about in the past. That, here he's making it sound like if you find yourself in a bad situation, you must have done something wrong to end up there. But I could have sworn he's talked about how in this world, bad things can often happen to good people. And he loves the story of Job. And I know, at least on the surface, the story of Job is about someone remaining devoted and loyal to God and refusing to denounce or curse God despite having all of this calamity and misfortune heaped upon them. But I think it's also a story about how bad things can happen to good people, So I think it's kind of weird that Peterson seems to be overlooking. I think it's just because he's being stubborn. He's defining truth, or belief rather, a certain way. And Parker is challenging that definition, and Peterson doesn't like that, so he's digging his heels in, even though it kind of makes him look like a sociopath for trying to say or suggest that if you find yourself in the position of having to lie to a murderous genocidal regime in order to save innocent lives, that you must have done something bad, or you must have made a series of mistakes or poor life choices to find yourself there or in that position. I mean, what would be the alternative? Just keep your head down, just keep being a cog in the machine, don't dare go out of your way to try to save innocent lives or prevent the regime from rounding up your neighbors? Like, what poor decisions would lead someone to be in that spot? It's crazy. And following Peterson's logic there, what would that say about concentration camp or death camp inmates? Did they do something wrong or make a series of poor decisions, Jordan, to end up to find themselves in the horrific situation of being in a death camp? No, a fascistic regime decided that certain members of the populace weren't fit for life and decide to round them up and murder them.
It's a hypothetical, and it's
You
not
can't answer
answerable.
hypotheticals?
No, I can't answer a hypothetical like
What?
that because
Did
it's
you eat
far.
today?
Look,
Did you
don't
eat today?
play games.
I'm not playing a game. I'm just
Yes,
asking if you
you
ate
are.
it.
If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing games.
Yeah, I think Peterson's just grinching out. He's stubborn, he's digging his heels in. And to me, it's a really straightforward hypothetical. Would you lie to the Nazis to save the lives of innocent Jews hiding up in your attic or whatever, right? Maybe Anne Frank. I think for most people, it would be an immediate yes. Why the hell wouldn't I? You know? And I'm someone who, generally speaking, I imagine like most of us, thinks that lying is bad, not only ethically, but practically speaking. You're usually making things harder on yourself. Lying just complicates things. But there are exceptions. Preserving human life, I think, is more important than whether or not you're telling a fib.
I just told you
Hypothetical.
I would do everything that I could to make sure that I'm never in that situation. By the time you've got there, you've made so many mistakes that there's nothing you can do that isn't a sin.
Being born in Nazi Germany and trying to protect people that you care about, like there could be a Jewish friend that you have and you want to protect them.
I think you should
have
just
them in
give
your
up on
attic.
that line of questioning.
Give up on just like trying to clarify your position? Because
I
you don't
did
like, are you like
clarify it.
uncomfortable with me asking this question? It's just a basic hypothetical. Like I could ask you.
It's just a
did you-
basic
yeah, yeah.
hypothetical
Like,
where you're,
like
you
if you-
put Jews' lives at stake in Nazi Germany. That's just a basic hypothetical.
Obviously, you would lie in that scenario to save their life, but you're like not trying to answer this question for some reason.
I just told you why.
Are you anti-fascist? Like, so you're
Why are
anti-fascist?
you asking that?
I was just asking, just clarifying.
And so usually I might think it's a little rude or a bit much to just suddenly ask someone if they're anti-fascist, but I get why Parker is doing it. Peterson is being faced with this very, I think, straightforward, once again, hypothetical, asking if you'd be willing to save Jewish lives by lying to the Nazis. And I think most people would say yes, of course, right? And if you didn't, the only reason not to lie in that situation would be either if you're an anti-Semite or if you're just deathly afraid of being caught lying. So you break down and admit that you're harboring someone, which isn't very commendable, right? I don't know if that happened. There probably were cases like that. But I get why Parker is asking him if he's anti-fascist, because by refusing to answer a pretty straightforward hypothetical that most people would answer yes to without hesitation, and by suggesting that if you're in a position where you find yourself trying to save an attic full of Jewish people from the Nazis, you must have done something wrong to end up there, right? Instead of painting that person as a hero, he's painting them as someone who must have made a series of poor life decisions. So it's kind of like, now, I don't think, at least I hope not, that Jordan Peterson is sympathetic to the Nazis, right? I don't think that by any stretch of the imagination, but by being a stubborn bastard and to the point where he's willing to suggest that someone trying to save Jewish lives by lying to the Nazis must have made a series of bad decisions to be in that spot. He kind of, I mean, he has it coming being asked whether or not he's anti-fascist.
But like, okay, again, you're not answering this hypothetical because you know it shows that you clearly would lie to save
I'm
someone's life.
answering it in
Obviously,
a
that's
manner
not what
you
truth
don't
is.
find acceptable.
Obviously, because I care about
you're-
truth.
I wouldn't be in that scenario.
Obviously, right? Logically, because that's
No.
already happened. Like that's in the past. You don't have a time to travel device. We're bringing this logical hypothetical up to show you that in some circumstances that do happen within the real world, you would lie to save people's lives. So your definition of truth isn't actually how we're typically using it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to muddy the waters when I ask you, like, do you believe this? Do you think this to be true? So you don't actually have to answer the questions. And plenty of Christians don't like that because they clearly see that you don't really like want to be associated with
I can
Christianity with that
imagine
respect.
that I was in a situation where the best I could do as a consequence of my previous mistakes was to tell the least amount of lie I could manage. But that would likely indicate that I had made all sorts of catastrophic errors on my way there.
So
Right.
you would lie to save someone's life. So again, you do believe it to be true in that circumstance, even though you like lied in that scenario. So
Not
clearly that's
without
not what
the
you see to be true.
context that I put it in.
You were not willing to
I
die for it. You
said-
were not willing to let other people die for it. So that's not what you see to be true then, seemingly.
You're doing exactly what I said you were doing at the beginning of the conversation. You're generating an impossible, restricted, hypothetical with no precursors to back me into a
How is
corner.
it possible? Is there something contradictory about it? Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. Yeah.
I don't think we necessarily had to drag Trunks' time machine, as Dragon Ball Z reference, into the hypothetical to explain why Peterson doesn't want to answer. Peterson's problem isn't that the event has already passed, so it doesn't make sense to ask what I would do. No, his problem is that he doesn't want to, he's just being stubborn. And so he doesn't want to, once again, answer a straightforward hypothetical. He even tripled down, saying once again he wouldn't be in that position, suggesting he wouldn't have made the series of poor life decisions that would have led him there, supposedly. When Jordan Peterson is a public figure, so we all know about his personal hardships. We know that he ended up getting addicted to benzodiazepines. I was going to say, I don't know what I'm getting at. I'm trying not to just deliver a low blow for the sake of delivering a low blow. But he's obviously made less than stellar life decisions. Did he make a series of poor life decisions that led him to get addicted to benzos, And this isn't my personal viewpoint. I'm just trying to see what would happen if we follow Jordan Peterson's logic. I'll put logic in quotes here and apply it to himself, because I'm actually sympathetic to Jordan Peterson and what he was going through. So I know Jordan Peterson's wife developed cancer, and luckily she battled through it and survived. But Jordan Peterson, understandably, was so distraught because of what his wife was going through that I think that was a big part of, as he tells it, of why he ended up relying on benzodiazepines so much and getting addicted. And then, in an attempt to get off of benzodiazepines, after at least one failed attempt to get off of them at a hospital in Canada, his daughter brought him to Russia, where he would spend the withdrawal period in a medically induced coma. He eventually woke up not knowing where the hell he was, strapped to a bed, and at one point he had been transported to a hospital in Serbia. And I'm trying to be responsible, so don't take this as gospel, so to speak, but the way I remember it being reported is that his daughter had gone out clubbing and, then returned to the hospital, and he caught COVID-19 while in the hospital in Serbia, and it could have been her that gave it to him. That's obviously like a catastrophic situation to be in. I'm sure we could analyze Jordan Peterson's life and try to figure out what poor life decisions, led him to be in such a horrific situation. But the point being, he's obviously not immune to making poor decisions himself. But in a hypothetical about whether or not you'd lie to save Jewish lives, suddenly, no, he wouldn't have made the bad decisions that would lead him to be in that position. It's just is it me or is it just me? Is it just very, very bizarre? And I know it's not just me, because many other people have criticized him for, his response or his performance here. So I forget the name of Jordan Peterson's next opponent, for lack of a better word here. But here Peterson kind of doubles down on defining God as conscience. And so we go deeper into that.
So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I see this kind of goes back to where I'm saying initially.
I'm not defining it. Elijah defined
so
it.
as Elijah defines
It's
God.
defined that way in Jonah too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also
got
defined
it.
it that way.
As I'm sure you know many people who've defined it that way, and it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm
okay.
just pointing out to you
Got
how
it.
God is defined in the Old
Okay.
Testament.
All right. So to respond to that, I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God. And that goes back to my kind of opening
Then how do we
statement.
specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, or again, it goes back to my example of the Mona
I'm
Lisa.
defining God as conscience.
Okay. So that's interesting, but then you're kind of expanding the meaning of
No,
God.
I'm not. That's how it's defined in the Old Testament.
Okay,
in
so-
Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever, so some.
It's not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the
Okay.
major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets.
All right.
He's equal in stature to Moses.
Okay.
So you can tell this is one of the people Peterson doesn't really care for either. And yeah, he got pretty snippy there. It's almost like he took offense on behalf of Elijah. He's like, it's not whoever. He's one of the, he's equal in stature to Moses. That was a weird attempt at a Jordan Peterson imitation anyway. To revisit the point I was trying to make earlier, it seems like, well, it doesn't seem, he's outright stating it. Peterson, at least one way he defines God, is he defines God as conscience. And I think he's framing it this way very intentionally. He's not saying that conscience is the voice of God, which is the way I think Christian theologians like Newman, who he keeps citing, would put it. I was reading that Newman, I know it's probably getting old, turned into a drinking game. One way he described conscience is that it's the echo of the voice of God, and that it was God letting you know his will, and your job was to align your will with the will of God. But Peterson is suggesting, no, it's not the voice of God, which would imply an external entity speaking to you in the form of your conscience, but rather conscience is God. And I think he's framing it that way so it can have a more kind of metaphorical interpretation. That way he gets to kind of have his cake and eat it too. He can define God as something that actually exists, your conscience, without declaring belief in an actual supernatural creator.
Right. So it's not arbitrary.
All right. So that is interesting, but it's not relevant to the context with which I am using the term God.
It's directly relevant. Atheists reject God, but they don't
Right, but
understand what they're rejecting. You accept conscience as a guide, and conscience is one of the defining characteristics of God in the Old Testament.
I think you're being intellectually disingenuous.
In what way?
Because, again,
I asked you if you believe
hey,
that conscience guided you.
You just asked me a question, and then you stopped me from answering it. In this setting, you understand the way I am using the term God and belief.
Not
and
in the least. I don't understand how you're using it in the least. That's why I'm trying to define it. My definition of God as conscience is a lot more precise and oriented than your definition of the God that you hypothetically disbelieve in.
It's weird. Peterson seems to speak with such conviction and indignation, and yet he has to be being disingenuous or, intellectually dishonest. Either that, or he's just, unhinged in some way, because he's saying he has no idea what this atheist sitting across from him means by God. He has absolutely no idea. And then he goes on to say that his definition of God as kind of being synonymous with conscience is much more clear and precise than the concept of God that the atheists sitting across from him, or atheists in general, seem to reject. And I know he knows what most atheists mean by God, because I believe I've heard him complain, possibly during this Jubilee appearance, that the concept of God that atheists tend to reject is overly, almost childishly simplistic or reductionist. It's the old man in the sky, who's constantly looking down and judging you. And that is a bit of a simplistic caricature. But yes, in a sense, that is close in essence to what non-believers like myself, the type of deity we tend to doubt the existence of. It doesn't literally have to be an anthropomorphic old man up on a cloud, but a personal creator God, a divine, sentient, supernatural entity that chose to bring everything into creation, that chose to make man, perhaps possessing the omnis, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. And it seems like I think most Christians would see the creator God as also being an interventionist God. That's kind of the point of prayer, that God can even intervene in human events. But of course, we did have people, there still might be deists out there. Famously, a number of the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, were deists. They did believe in some kind of higher power who kickstarted everything, but then kind of backed off and doesn't interfere in human affairs. But yeah, in general, when atheists say they don't believe in God, they mean some kind of supernatural personal creator God. And Jordan Peterson knows that. And maybe for context, and we're kind of deep in now, it probably would have been more helpful if I remembered to do this earlier. But I should let you know what the quote unquote prompt or the kind of debate statement was for this point. And Peterson came up with his own prompts. And during this segment of his Jubilee event, the prompt was, atheists reject God, but they don't know what they're rejecting. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. I believe he just said it in that clip. And so he's been defining God as conscience, which once again I think is a little weaselly or intellectually dishonest. I say this as a non-believer, but as someone interested in spirituality, from what I understand, what I've recently read, is that the Christian theological position is more that your conscience is a manifestation of the voice of God, or as Newman put it, an echo of the voice of God. Paraphrasing. So it's not that, God is simply synonymous with your conscience. And I'm trying not to be, too repetitive, but I believe I said just a bit ago that I think Peterson deliberately chooses to word it that way so that his definition of God is more open to a potential figurative interpretation. And that leaves him room to continue dodging and tap dancing around, answering the question of whether or not he actually believes in a supernatural personal creator God. And I think that's where both Christians and atheists start to get frustrated or lose patience with Peterson. Because although, there are some Christians, perhaps even Christian theologians, who take a more kind of rarefied, highbrow, figurative approach to defining quote unquote God. But I think it's safe to say for the average Christian and for non-believers like myself, when we're talking about the Christian God, what we mean on both sides is usually a personal creator God, or some kind of divine intelligence behind it all. Not God as merely a metaphor for your conscience or for the embodiment of your highest ideals, or however it was that Peterson defined God in the past along those lines, figuratively.
Relevant to the fault lines of this debate.
How is it irrelevant?
Because in common parlance, when we're talking about atheists, God, belief, not belief,
I
we're
don't
not
care
talking
about common parlance. I'm trying to get to something fundamental.
I just had to stop there because I thought that was kind of beautiful. I don't care about common parlance. Yeah, that's probably a big part of your problem. People have to struggle to understand you. And either because he's stubborn or he's so dedicated to the idea of trying to have his cake and eat it too, he seems loath or refuses to engage with the way in which, once again, I think both Christians and atheists tend to define God. And he kind of tap dances around the big important theological questions that most people care about, like whether or not there's an actual creator out there, or whether or not we actually go somewhere after we die.
I think your point is irrelevant to the way that people
Which
tend to use
point?
these words. Your point that there are these polysemous
I didn't make
ideas
that
of
point.
God.
You did.
I
made a specific
characterized
point
it,
that God
right.
was associated with conscience.
I just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
No, he's not retreating into a semantic fog. He lives in a semantic fog, but perhaps he is also retreating. That seems to be a special skill. He's a kind of obfuscation ninja, throwing smoke bombs and disappearing into the semantic fog whenever asked directly if he actually believes God exists or whatever. But I love that phrasing. Retreating into the semantic fog. And Peterson is so petty or catty. It's like, I'm not retreating, sir. I'm advancing. You're retreating. There's my horrible Peterson impression again. So just so I can wrap my own head around it, the guy is trying to get Peterson to at least acknowledge the common way in which people tend to define God or what they mean by God. And Peterson accuses the guy of retreating because the guy is yet to concede to Peterson's definition of God as conscience. And even though the Bible, did I say that weird? The Bible does sometimes kind of describe or suggest that conscience or that inner voice is the voice of God. To say that the Bible defines God as conscience is, that's a very limited definition of God. The Bible defines God as being much, much more than just that. He's portrayed as the creator of all that exists, as a national deity, a being that endows prophets like Moses and Elijah with the power to perform supernatural miracles. But you get my point, and there was one more interaction that I wanted to kind of dissect or respond to.
And so if you take inspiration from Christian ideas, then insofar as you do that, you are in fact a believer, which was my point with regards to atheists
Correct.
not understanding
But have
what
you
they're
taken
rejecting.
inspiration from Taoism or from studying Egyptian mythology?
Definitely.
So then you believe them under that definition?
Yeah, but I've incorporated them into something I think that's more comprehensive.
Is it possible to take inspiration and to appreciate the teachings without being a believer in their truth claims?
It depends. No, I don't think so. But I think, you see, there are different kinds of truth claims, right? There's propositional truth claims, which are the truth claims of what you say. And then there's embodied truth claims, which is the truth claims of what you do. That should be prioritized. Optimally, what you say and what you do would be brought into harmony. But I would say if you had to prioritize, it should be what you attend to and what you act first. And that's what Christ actually says in the Gospels, because he points to the Pharisees, for example, who say all the right things, but don't do any of the right things, and points out very clearly that that's not acceptable.
I don't know that the Christian morality, those principles originate in Christianity, because you brought up other things that predate Christianity that you can very closely tie connections to.
Well, I don't think they do originate precisely. I mean,
Right.
I don't think the Christian claim is exactly that they originate in Christianity.
So if I'm
right?
living those values, how is it that I'm living the Christian values and maybe not the Egyptian values or something else?
Well,
that you
one of
brought
the,
up?
one of,
Pause there. You've been voted out by
that was
the
good. That was good.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that there was a male opponent that Peterson, right off the bat, really seemed to take a liking to, and he kind of handled him in a very polite and patient manner, and that was the kid. And I say kid, but he was probably like the majority of the Jubilee opponents Peterson faced, roughly around college age, maybe somewhere in his early to mid 20s. And I thought he handled himself very well. And I was kind of like, oh, damn, when he got cut off or they ran out of time, right when he was starting to ask Peterson what seemed like a very important or poignant question. And I cut that clip down for the sake of time. But right before it begins, Peterson spends a decent amount of time going into how he studied things like Egyptian mythology, Taoism, and he learned a lot from them, etc. And so the kid is asking him, because Peterson suggests or states that, let's say, if you read the Bible and you find inspiration in the ideas or the writings, according to Peterson, that's tantamount to belief. So, like I myself, there's parts of the Bible, like some of the archaic barbarism, etc., that I find offensive. And I, as a non-believer, I obviously don't take the miracle stories literally, etc. But there's still stories and books of the Bible that I find inspirational, moving, that I think if you interpret them symbolically, as Peterson does, they can be very powerful. So according to Peterson, that would make me, a Christian. Or if we're talking about the Old Testament, I guess would make me Jewish. I don't know. I don't know. And the kid, I don't mean kid in a derogatory sense. I believe his name is Liam. He kind of turned, in a very polite way, tries to turn the tables. And he begins to ask Peterson, all right, so, and this is interesting because I think it gives us some insight into what Peterson actually believes. Like, Peterson admits that some of these important ideas that we find in the Bible predate Christianity or predate the Bible. And he also admits to finding inspiration and meaning in mythology and Eastern traditions like Taoism, as do I. And I've already known this about Peterson because I've watched some of his old college lectures, etc. But I think in a sense he's showing just how figurative his approach is. To him, Christian belief doesn't necessarily have to be defined as believing in the resurrected Christ, literally. Just flipping through the Bible and being inspired is tantamount to belief. And you can also find some of the same kind of meaning and value in, mythology. And so Liam asks him, or starts to ask him before, they run out of time. And I'm paraphrasing, but I think this captures the gist or essence of the question. If you can find those same principles or concepts in pre-Christian or pre-biblical traditions, how do you know you're following or believing in Christianity and not believing in ancient Egyptian religion or whatever the non-biblical tradition in question is? And once again, I thought that was a really good question. And of course, they ran out of time, so we didn't get an answer. But Peterson did kind of give us an answer to a similar question earlier in that same clip, when Liam asked him if he did find inspiration and meaning in things like Egyptian mythology or ancient Egyptian religion or Taoism. And Peterson, without hesitation, says, oh yes, definitely. But he quickly adds the caveat as if he's trying to downplay the fact that he was able to derive meaning or inspiration from these non-biblical, non-Judeo-Christian traditions. That, but it's not a big deal. That seemed to be his attitude. I took those ideas that I found useful and incorporated them into something bigger or more holistic. And my takeaway from that answer was, even though he doesn't say this verbatim, that he considers these other traditions as lesser and not as important as the biblical corpus. And he said as much, that he places a great deal of importance on the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, and that he thinks that Christianity and Christian or biblical values undergird all of Western civilization, and without that foundation, we'd be lost. So he definitely has a clear bias towards the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I know some people take issue with that term, Judeo-Christian. They read all sorts of political connotations or implications into it, but I myself use it as kind of a quick shorthand to reference the cultural influence of not just the New Testament, but also the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And before you jump on me, I do know that there are differences between the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, such as the order of the books. Some books included in the Old Testament are excluded from the Hebrew Bible, etc. But you get my point. And I think that helps explain why Peterson defends or champions Christianity and the Bible so passionately or adamantly when he doesn't even seem to be an actual believer when you strip away the semantic fog. It's because he thinks the values are integral to Western culture and civilization. Could be the possibility that's also partly a grift, or there's a certain amount of audience capture at work as well. But in fairness, I imagine only he knows that for sure. I'm not inside his head. Like I said earlier, even though I'm a non-believer, even I find value or inspiration in certain biblical texts or stories or biblical or Christian symbolism. But I don't place the Bible, unlike Peterson, I don't place the Bible or the Judeo-Christian tradition above other traditions, including those ancient dead religions and beliefs that we now label mythology. I've been fascinated by mythology since I was a kid, and I have a real reverence for it. I've always found many of those ancient stories and the symbols within to be very inspirational and empowering and psychologically transformative. Yeah, but I'm kind of running on fumes now, and I'm too tired to even do the shameless plugging. So, as always, thank you for listening, brothers and sisters, and until next time.